It was winter break of my sophomore year at the University of Georgia, and I was home for the holidays at my mother's house in Metro Atlanta. It was just after Christmas, and my mom came and told me that she had just planned an impromptu road trip to visit our relatives in Buffalo, New York. She and my sister were going to go on this road trip, and did I want to go with them? Well, her plans had them staying at a cheap hotel somewhere between Atlanta and Buffalo on New Year's Eve. And that didn't sound like a great way to spend New Year's Eve to me, especially because I already had plans. My boyfriend and I were going to drive back to Athens, Georgia, near the university, and we were going to go to a college party for New Year's Eve. Now, it may seem a little heartless of me that I would choose this college party over my Buffalo relatives, but you have to understand something. In the previous few years, I had been to some other New Year's Eve parties with my friends, and I always had a good time at these parties. I enjoyed celebrating with my friends, but then there was always that moment right after the stroke of midnight when everything would go silent and the couples would look lovingly into one another's eyes, and then they would share the first kiss of the new year. And I would stare at my shoes and wait for the moment to pass because I was never at any of these parties with a date. In fact, I didn't date anybody at any time of the year, seriously, until I was in college. And because of this, that New Year's kiss, it took on a magical, mythical property to me. And I thought, well, maybe someday I will have that. Well, that New Year's Eve, that was when it was going to happen because I was going to that party with my boyfriend. And so I told my mom, yeah, say hi to the relatives, I am not going to Buffalo. Well, so my boyfriend John and I, we drove back to Athens on New Year's Eve. We went to my friend Jess's townhome, and we went in, we joined the party. It was a pretty typical college party. There was drinking, there were small groups of people gathered in dark corners having deep philosophical conversations. Now, most of us at the party knew each other from a literary society at UGA, so we had especially profound drunken conversations. And I am happy to report to you that I am an adorable drunk. I was then, and I still am. And on that particular night, my adorable drunkenness manifested itself in me hiding people's shoes. So they would arrive at the party and take their shoes off, and then I would sneak behind them and take their shoes and put them somewhere else in the house. This was very irritating to people who wanted to leave before midnight. But I think it was a public service, because if they were too drunk to find their shoes, then they should not be driving. Well, over the course of the evening with the partying and the shoe hiding, at some point, I sat down in the middle of Jess's big fluffy couch, and I leaned my head back, and the next thing I knew, John was tapping me on the forehead. I looked up at him groggily. What? It's midnight. Kiss me. So my first New Year's kiss was maybe not as magical and mythical as I thought it would be, mostly due to my own actions. But the good news is that John and I are still together. And so we have shared many, many New Year's kisses since then, some of them more memorable than others. Like there was the New Year's right after we got married. We got married in August of 2008, and 2 weeks later we moved to Norwich, England, where John was studying abroad. So we stayed in England all through the fall semester, and then we decided we wanted to go home for the holidays to celebrate Christmas with our families, and we'd have to return to England for the spring semester. Well, we did that. We flew home to Georgia, and we were home for Christmas. But then as we were booking our return flight, we quickly realized that it is much, much cheaper to fly into London's Heathrow Airport on December 31st than it is to fly in on January 1st or 2nd or 3rd, because most people wait until after New Year's to go back home. So we did the responsible thing and we did book our flight for December 31st. We arrived in London late in the day. We were tired from a day of travel. And it was a 2-hour train ride to get from London to Norwich, where we were living. We had all this heavy luggage. We decided that we would just spend the night in London and we would take the train back to Norwich the next day. London could be a really cool place to celebrate New Year's. And actually, I have a little bit of a history with London and New Year's, because back when I was in high school, my high school marching band was invited to march in the Millennium Parade in London on New Year's 2000. I desperately wanted to go. My mother said that the first time that I traveled abroad, it should be special. I could not imagine what would be more special than marching in the Millennium Parade, but I didn't get to go, and some of my friends called me when it was midnight in London. Well, there we were, finally, in London on New Year's, but we were tired from traveling, so we actually didn't leave the hotel. We were tired from traveling, but we were also still on Georgia time, and so we were awake. Well, that year we had agreed to give each other inexpensive Christmas gifts because we were spending so much money on travel. And what I had given to John for Christmas was a promise that I would play World of Warcraft with him. It's one of those online games, if you're not familiar with it. He decided to cash in on that gift that night, so we set up our laptops side by side in the hotel room and created a character for me, and we played World of Warcraft long into the night. And at some point, John looked at the clock on his laptop, and then he said, "Hey, it's midnight. Kiss me." And then there was the very next New Year's. After John finished his degree in spring of 2009, we moved back to Georgia, and our daughter Virginia was born at the beginning of December 2009. She was about 3 weeks old on Christmas. A lot of the relatives came over to our place for Christmas morning, and she was just the most perfect baby that morning. She slept through the whole thing, and she was passed around from one person to the next, all of them just so happy to snuggle this little sleeping baby. But that was not typical of what Virginia was like as a newborn. She had baby reflux, so it was uncomfortable for her to lie down, and so she mostly cried when she wasn't being held, and sometimes even when she was. So John and I were the typical haggard, sleepless new parents. And that New Year's Eve, my mother came over to our place with a gift. It was a quilt. Now, when she had learned that she was going to have her first grandchild, she had reached out to all of our friends and relatives and asked each of them to make a quilt square for the new baby. And then she had contacted our friend Jess, the same one who had thrown that college party, and she asked Jess to sew the quilts together. Jess is a very talented seamstress, among other things. Well, this was a big project with many moving parts. So my mom had hoped that the quilt would be done when the new baby arrived, but it wasn't quite finished then. Well, and then she thought maybe it would be done in time for Christmas, but it wasn't quite done on Christmas. It was done by New Year's Eve, so she brought it over to the house, and we unfolded it and admired all of the beautiful squares. We draped it over the couch and put Virginia on it to take a picture of her, and she was screaming the whole time. And then I sat on the couch holding Virginia, who was still crying. We talked to my mom for a few minutes, and she was about to go. But she could see how tired I was, and she could see that I probably wasn't going to get any sleep that night, and it wasn't because I was going to be up partying, waiting to ring in the new year. So she stopped and she said, "Well, why don't you let me hold the baby for a while, and you just go lie down and try to get some sleep." So I handed Virginia over, I went into the bedroom, I laid down, but I was sure I was not going to be able to fall asleep because I could still hear her crying. I must have fallen asleep though, because the next thing I knew, John was tapping me on the forehead. looked up at him groggily. What? It's midnight. Kiss me. Thank you. So I mentioned in the last story that John and I lived in England right after we got married, and so this next story takes place in England. I walked up to Ancient House Museum. It had this big wooden door, and it was set in a row of other shops and houses. Now, Ancient House, you might guess from the name, had actually been a house that people had lived in for hundreds of years before it was converted into a museum. I walked through that big front door, and the inside of the museum, it was all this heavy, dark wood. Wood floors, wood walls, wood ceilings, and exposed beams. Now, right inside the door, there was this hallway that went straight back to a room at the back of the house. That was the room that the museum used to house their ticket counter and their gift shop. On the left side of the hallway, there was a little room that had some display cases and some artifacts, and there was the entryway to the stairs that led up to the second floor. And on the right side, there was a great big opening that led into this large front room with several things on display. And then through that room, you could get to another big room on the back of the house that was the kitchen. It had been the kitchen when people had lived in it as a house. And the museum kept it put together like a kitchen. There was a wood-burning stove. There was a table with fake food set out on it. Along one wall, up by the ceiling, there was a string of taxidermied rabbits because one of the families who had lived in the house had been rabbit farmers. And then over in another corner of the kitchen, there was a mangle. It's the thing that you would use to wring out your clothes after you had washed them by hand. Well, then back in that front hallway, there was the entryway up to the second floor. And the second floor was mostly two big rooms. That first room at the top of the stairs had the Roman Britain collection, artifacts from the time when England had been part of the Roman Empire. And then the second room had artifacts from another era. But through that second room, there was a door to a staff-only area where there was a table and some chairs that could be used for meetings. That's where I was headed that day. I was meeting with the volunteer coordinator. We were living in Norwich, as I said, so my husband could study abroad. And Norwich is a large city and a train hub in the southeastern part of England. Thetford, where Ancient House is located, is right next door to Norwich. It's just one stop on the train. And as I spoke with the volunteer coordinator, I told her about how I knew that I needed something to keep myself occupied during the day. John had his classes he was going to, and what I wanted to do to keep busy was to volunteer. And I had been attracted to Ancient House because of that Roman Britain collection, because I was a Latin major in college, and I'm a storyteller, and I thought, well, maybe I could tell stories from Roman history, Roman mythology, in some of their museum programs. But the volunteer coordinator said they had just done a program that related to their Roman Britain collection, and they probably weren't going to do another program like that for a while. Well, I was there, and I still needed something to do. So I said, oh, okay, well, what other programs do you have planned? I'm sure there's some way that I can contribute. She said their very next program was going to be stories from around the world. They wanted to have a volunteer in each room of the house, and each of them telling stories from a different country. And then guests at the museum could go from one room to the next and listen to the stories. They would have to guess what country each story was from. And then they'd have a map and they could put a sticker on each country that they had heard a story from. And I said, oh, that's easy. I can tell American stories. So she said that was fine, and she wrote it down in her notebook. Then she said their next program would be about the 1960s. I had to think about that one for a minute, because literally everybody else who volunteered at the museum was actually alive in the 1960s, and I was not. But I said, okay, well, what if I had a table where kids could come by and make protest posters? She said that was fine. She wrote it down in her notebook, and she said, okay, the next program that we have scheduled is at the beginning of December, and it's called Christmas Under Fire, and it's about what it was like celebrating Christmas in England during World War II. I had to think a little longer about that one, but finally I said, okay, what if I were to play Christmas carols on my guitar and sing, and people as they came by, they could stop and they could sing 1 or 2 songs with me. She thought that was a good idea, and she wrote it down in her notebook, and then we agreed we had done enough planning for one day, so we shook hands, and I got back on the train to Norwich. But the volunteer coordinator only thought it was a good idea for me to play and sing Christmas carols because she did not know some key pieces of information. Firstly, I had just purchased my first guitar. Yeah, I grew up playing piano, but piano is an instrument that does not travel well. So when we moved to England, I really missed having an instrument to play, and I went down to the music store. I bought a purple 3/4 size guitar and a couple of lesson books, and I started teaching myself how to play. So we moved to England in September, and this program was in December. Not a lot of time to become proficient enough to play Christmas carols. Secondly, although speaking in front of people does not make me that nervous, playing musical instruments in front of people really does. And I knew this from all those years of piano lessons because I had played in recitals and competitions, and I knew that I would definitely be nervous about playing guitar in front of people. And then finally, I've never been a good singer. So it wasn't as if my singing was going to bring up my guitar playing. With any luck, the guitar playing would drown out the singing. But the volunteer coordinator didn't know any of those things, so she thought that it was a good idea. As soon as I got back to Norwich, I went to the public library and I checked out a book of Christmas songs. It had the melody line and all the lyrics and then chords for the guitar. I went home and I started looking through this book, and I looked up a few songs on the internet, and I was deciding what I was going to learn to play for this Christmas program. I had 3 criteria I used to choose songs. The song had to have been published during World War II or earlier, so it would not be anachronistic for the program. It was pretty easy to find the copyright dates for the song, so that one was not too hard. Then, the song also had to be familiar in England, not just familiar to me as an American. I felt pretty good about the songs that were in the book because I had checked the book out in England. I was not as sure about the songs that I was getting from the internet. One song in particular I had a question about was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But then as it got a little closer to Christmas, one of our neighbors decorated the arm of a park bench to look like Rudolph. And it was not just any reindeer, it had the red nose, so it was definitely him. And I thought, aha, somebody here knows Rudolph. I think I can play this song. And then finally, all the songs that I chose had to be songs that I could actually learn to play. My plan was to just strum chords and then sing the melody, but even so, there are some chords that a novice guitar player is just not going to learn in that amount of time, and any song that used those chords was not a song I could choose. I did make one exception, and that was for Deck the Halls, because Deck the Halls is an excellent sing-along song, and if it made it past the first 2 criteria, it seemed like a shame to throw it out based on the 3rd one. So what I did for Deck the Halls was that I transposed it into a different key that would let me play easier chords, because what I lack in technical guitar playing ability, I make up for in music theory knowledge. So I finally chose all the songs I was going to learn. I printed out the ones from the internet, and I photocopied the ones that were in the book, and then I returned the book to the library because maybe someone else would want it before Christmas. And then I started practicing, and I practiced and practiced and practiced, and my fingertips got sore, and then they got calluses, and there were some days when I thought, this is going to be amazing. I am going to pull this off. I'm going to play these songs great. I am going to be a good singer for the first time in my life. And then there were other times when I thought, I'm going to make a fool of myself. This is the worst decision that I've ever made. And I went back and forth between the 2 extremes, sometimes during the same practice session. But then the day of the program finally came. And most of the volunteer work that I did happened during the day while John was in classes, but this program was scheduled for the evening. And so I told John that he absolutely had to come with me and help me sing. We got on the train together with the guitar and the music, and we rode over to Thetford. We walked into Ancient House. The volunteer coordinator was waiting for me to show me where to set up. She put me in that room at the other end of the hallway from the front door with the ticket counter and the gift shop. It was a room that pretty much everybody who came into the museum was going to go into. Now, because they had the gift shop there and there were all these different things on display that were for sale, there were not a lot of places I could stand where I was not blocking the flow of traffic. So she suggested that I stand on top of this window in the floor. The window looked down into a well. It was the well that the people who had lived in the house had used for drinking water. Now, in the glass, there was etching that explained about all of this. It also said that now shrimp live in the well. But I never saw the shrimp in all the time that I spent at Ancient House because the glass was always fogged over. So I stood on top of this hole in the floor, and I took out my guitar and tuned it, and I got out my music. I had a couple chairs where I could prop my music up, and then I had sheets with the lyrics on them because I wanted people who came by to have no excuse to not sing with me. Oh, you don't know all the words? That is no problem. They're right here. We got all set up and people started trickling into the museum, and at first I wasn't sure if I should wait for people to come by and try to convince them to sing with me, or if I should just start playing and singing and hope that it would attract people. Over the course of the evening I did some of both, and things were kind of going okay. There was this one moment when I was trying to convince a little boy to sing Rudolph with me. And I said, do you want to sing it just the regular way? Or do you want to sing it with the exclamations? You know, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, reindeer had a very shiny nose, like a light bulb. And he looked at me like I was crazy. So maybe they know Rudolph in England, but they don't sing it with the exclamations, which when you think about it kind of makes sense because the last one is, you'll go down in history, like George Washington. And they really feel differently about George Washington than we do. Yeah, so that was my mistake. But things were really going okay, and I was starting to think I was going to make it through this program without anything really terrible happening. And as we got toward the end of the night and things were kind of slowing down, this tall gentleman walked into our room and walked over to us. And when I first saw him, I thought he looked just like any other British dude. All that stood out about him to me was that he was a little taller than anyone else we had seen that night, and he was by himself. And it was mostly families who came to these sorts of programs. But that was fine. He came over and he said he wanted to sing with us. He looked through the music, and first he chose Hark the Herald Angels Sing, so I started playing and we sang together. And then he wanted to sing another song. He picked out Angels We Have Heard on High. And nobody else had chosen that song that night. And to be honest, it was one of the harder ones for me to play of the songs that I had chosen, because there's some really fast chord changes in the Gloria. And so somewhere during the song, I got really lost. He and John were singing a different part of the song than what I was playing, and I had stopped singing because I was so lost. We didn't finish together. They finished, and I just stopped playing. It was a train wreck. But I looked up, and this guy, he seemed like he hadn't noticed. He stood there for a second, and he looked me and John up and down, and then he said, "You guys are Americans." Now, I had been so worried about someone figuring out that I was not a good guitar player or not a good singer, I hadn't given a lot of thought to how ridiculous it was to have an American in a program on what it was like in England during World War II. And I just said, yeah, you got me. He said, no, it's okay. I'm an American too. I'm in the military. I've been stationed here in Thetford for a while. I'm going to be here through the holidays. And, you know, I had never seen this museum before. I didn't even know this was happening tonight. I was just walking by on the street. I could hear there was something going on, so I came in to check it out, and I have to thank you guys because I didn't think I was going to get the chance to sing Christmas carols with other Americans this year. And then he shook our hands and he left, and then the program was over. So I packed up the guitar and my music and helped put the chairs back, and then John and I got the train back to Norwich. And as I was on the train and thinking about how the night had went, I was really tempted to kind of pat myself on the back and think, you know, maybe this started out as a harebrained idea, but really, it was fine. And I did a good thing. I gave this guy the gift of home for the holidays. But a friend of mine told me that if you're the hero of your story, you're probably telling it wrong. And I'm really not the hero of this story. I'm the fool of this story, which I'm okay with because the fool is an important character and adds comic relief. The hero of the story was that man who came in at the end of the night because he gave his entire self to singing with us. Not because I was doing a good job, but out of the sheer joy of being in communion with his fellow human beings. And that is something that we all need when we're celebrating Christmas under fire.